I describe the Washington lawyer in three ways. One, influencing legislation. Two, intervening with the executive branch. Three, appearing before the federal judiciary. That's still basically what it's all about, except there's a lot more than doing it now, which gives it an aura of respectability that it probably didn't have before.
At a time in life when many lawyers have exchanged work for relaxation, Charlie undertook a major assignment for the D.C. Bar, what turned out to be a 4-year study of the D.C. courts, culminating in what is known as the Horsky Report, which led to a wide range of improvements in the operation of the local courts. Charlie was characteristically understated about his qualifications to take on that effort when asked to do so by the Board of Governors of the Bar.
I was asked to chair a study of the courts. I said I was the worst person in the world. I don't know anything about the D.C. courts. I never appeared in the D.C. courts. No, I take that back. I moved an admission in the D.C. Court of Appeals once, and I won. But they said, that's exactly what we want, somebody without any prejudice.
Charlie agreed to take on the assignment. Sam Harahan was hired to head the study committee staff. One outgrowth of the Horsky Report was the establishment of the Council for Court Excellence, an organization of judges, lawyers, and citizens committed to improving the court system. Sam Harahan became the first executive director and held the position for over 20 years.
The Council for Court Excellence really came about for three reasons. First, the Bar had completed this major study that Mr. Horsky and I and many others were involved in, which came to be called the Horsky Report, but the recommendations were not self-executing. And so one of the reasons why the Council for Court Excellence came into being was that we needed a vehicle in order to implement the recommendations coming out of the Horsky Committee. The second reason why I think it gravitated to being formed was that the Unified Bar and other groups were not really kind of present enough to provide sustained support to the court system. Finally, we came across a group in New York City called the Fund for Modern Courts when we were doing research for the Horsky Committee report, and it had active business and civic and legal leadership in that entity, and that became the organization that we initially modeled the council after.
Rufus King, former Chief Judge of the Superior Court, describes the benefit of the court's implementation of the committee's recommendations.
Over the years, as the report was issued, the recommendations became increasingly adopted, but it has made a huge difference in the operation of the court and the court's outstanding position among state courts in as a unusually strong and well-functioning urban trial court.
Everyone who ever worked with Charlie Horsky loved the experience and the man.
Charlie was a prince of a fellow. He was a pleasure to work with. Charlie always took the high road. Charlie was the kind of person that would always back you up and always be supportive of what you're doing, but at the same time was very willing to do what needed to be done. Another attribute that I can think of with Charlie is that Charlie had no ego. One of our board members once described Charlie in a football term that Charlie's the only guy he's ever met that when he comes out on the football field he's not wearing a number. In Washington, with all this high-priced type A talent, everybody wants to be quarterback. Mr. Horsky would play any role that a situation demanded, and that really made it a joy to work with him.
We've learned something of Charlie Horsky, the advocate, the civic and bar leader, the public servant. What of Charlie the person, the partner, the father, the Mountain West native? Jim McKay was Charlie Horsky's partner at Covington and Burling for 40 years and has himself been a leading figure in the D.C. bar for over a half-century.
When I first met Charlie Horsky, in 1945, I'd been hired as a law clerk at Covington and Burling while attending night school at Georgetown University Law School. Charlie greeted me as though I was Mr. Burling Sr. I never knew a more generous or friendly person than Charlie Horsky. Everybody from the top to the bottom loved him. Beneficiary of his generosity. When my wife and I had purchased a house, had contracted to buy a house, and at the same time we had to sell the house in which we were living in order to be able to close the deal. Well, unfortunately, we were $5,000 short. We couldn't sell the house in which we were living. Well, I thought, I'll see if Mr. Burling Jr. would sign a note on behalf of the firm so that I could borrow the money from the bank, and he said he would do that. Well, I'd no sooner gotten back into my office after speaking with Mr. Burling Jr. than in walks Charlie Horsky. And he looks at me and says, "I hear you need some money." Well, I said, "Yeah, I do need some money." He said, "Well, how much?" I said, "Well, $5,000. He sat down, took out his checkbook, wrote a check for $5,000, handed it to me and said, "I don't care when you pay this back, and I don't want any interest." Well, it was just tons and tons of worry just suddenly disappeared in my life, in my wife's life. It's difficult to sum things up with respect to Charlie Horsky, but I would sum it up by saying that Charlie, born and bred in his beloved Montana, was the salt of the earth.
Margaret Ellen Horsky Nunez, Charlie's daughter, remembers her father with the greatest affection and admiration.
I first met Horsky in February 1945 when he and his wife and my mother, Barbara, chose me to be their daughter. I was a very, very fortunate child. When I was 8, I was introduced to riding horses, and throughout my years to my 20s, Dad gave up every weekend to run me around to horse shows. Dad used to go to Montana every year, and it was his salvation. He would work very hard for Covington and all his various things that he had his hands into. And he would come to a place called Lincoln, Montana. Dad just relaxed. He drove my grandpa, Judge Anton Horsky, and his wife Millie lived also in the same property as my dad. And my Aunt Flora and Uncle Sherman, they would come up too, and their boys, John and Tony. And Dad's favorite thing to do out there was go fly fishing. And he also rode horses out there. And I did too. And Dad would take me to the rodeos. He'd take me into Helena and we'd go to the rodeos. And then Dad got interested in horses. And we had a horse here that I never rode, but his name was Spanish Sea. He was a point-to-point racehorse. And Ethel Kennedy used to ride him at the Washington Horse Show, which Dad was president of for many years. And there's a lot of things that Dad did, but he never realized how proud I was to be his daughter and how fortunate and what a good life he gave me.
Charlie Horsky's annual return to Montana, the place of his birth, renewed his spirit and undoubtedly contributed to his serene disposition. Judge Jim Belson was a frequent companion on those treks to the Mountain West.
I've come to realize that I didn't really know Charlie Horsky as a person until I spent some time with him in 1990 in Montana, his native state. His father had built a cabin there in the early 1900s. Charlie later built a cottage on the same parcel of land. It was a simple cottage, unpretentious, but comfortable. Charlie was also very comfortable up in the mountains, which he loved. And every year he hired an outfitting company owned by the Hefner family called the K. Lazy 3 Ranch Outfitters. And Charlie would ride with them and his group up into the mountains for 10 days or 2 weeks every summer. The members of the Hefner family who heard that I was taking part in this video, without my even asking for it, sent me some of their memories of Charlie. And I'd like to read those and speak it the way they said it. Jeff Hefner, who was maybe in his late 20s at that time, was the son of the person who started the company, his father Ken Hefner. Mary Faith Hefner, his mother, was then, say, in her late 50s, and they were along on that trip. Here's what Jeff had to say about Charlie. I remember him playing cribbage with Dad. He'd go fly fishing. He'd like to go down to the creek and catch a fish. It didn't have to be a big one, just catch a fish. He was happy. He felt at peace in the mountains. He was just part of the landscape and part of the mountains. He was relaxed and at home. I've never seen a person who loved nature as much as Charlie. He'd just sit back, smoke his pipe, and observe. He just loved being there. He didn't have to do anything fancy, anything exciting, and he never, ever complained about anything, the food, the horseback ride, the pain. He didn't pack much. An old sleeping bag, an old jacket, and a couple of changes of clothes. Nothing fancy. And never talked about what he did. He never talked about Washington. And Mary Faith Hefner said this: Charlie liked the simple things in life. In camp, he enjoyed the birds and the chipmunks and the squirrels. He'd spread peanut butter on a piece of paper, take a string and hang it on a branch, and he'd watch as the camp robbers, the Canadian jays, ate the treat. One thing he loved most back at camp was the bonfire. As soon as we got back to camp, everyone would gather sticks for the fire. He and Barbara would sing all Montana songs. He was a fabulous singer, and so was Barbara, great singers. He'd always sit back and smoke his pipe and enjoy his surroundings. The last years he rode into the backcountry, we'd have to lift him onto his horse and lift him off his horse. He wasn't too proud. He just wanted to be back in the scapegoat. He always told me if he died back there, it would be fine. He wouldn't mind.
How to sum up? When Charlie died, the Washington Post published an appreciative editorial that began, "In so many ways that few people may realize, what is good about Washington, hometown and world capital, can be linked to Charles A. Horsky." John Pickering, himself a giant in the D.C. bar and a great supporter of civic causes, reflecting on his own long career, remarked, "Charlie Horsky was my personal hero. The proudest thing I ever said about my work was, 'I'm helping Horsky.'" Frank Sinatra once introduced a film clip of Fred Astaire, admonishing us to watch it carefully because you won't see the likes of this again. Charlie Horsky was a beautiful human being who gave everything he could to his family, his community, and his nation. He was always a force for good. We are not likely to see the likes of him for a very long time.
To honor Charlie's remarkable career, Covington and Burling established and endowed the Charles A. Horsky Scholarships at the University of the District of Columbia to support the education each year of deserving graduates of District of Columbia high schools who choose to enroll as full-time students in UDC. To date, the scholarships have assisted over 25 students to complete a 4-year course of study at UDC.